Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 614 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Jonathan Kay, who also appeared back in episode 392 to discuss his books Your Move, about the history of board games, and Among the Truthers, about the psychology behind conspiracy theories. His articles have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Harper's, and he's currently a senior editor at Quillette. And in this interview, we'll be getting his thoughts on the new Apple TV Plus series Pluribus, about an alien virus that transforms most of humanity into an extremely cheerful hive mind, and discussing his book Panics and Persecutions, which explores some of the worst excesses of cancel culture. And this will include spoilers for Season 1 of Pluribus, so just be aware of that. And now here's our interview with Jonathan Kay. All right, so we're here with Jonathan Kay. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Okay, so I noticed that you recently changed your Twitter background to a scene from Pluribus. So how'd that come about?
Well, I started watching the show, obviously, and for anybody who's seen the show, the first scene where it has nothing to do with the plot of the show, but they're establishing character for the protagonist, is this woman named Carol Sturka. It's like one of the most brilliant openings to a series. Again, it has nothing to do with the plot. There's no like science fiction aspect to it. But the protagonist she's an author, and she's appearing at some local, like, I don't know, some library or a community center.
No, it's a Barnes & Noble.
Barnes & Noble, there you go. And there's all these women who are her fans. She writes genre fiction. It's like kind of steamy pot boiler pirate romance.
It's like romantasy, like fantasy romance.
Yeah. Like it sounds like there's some sort of Game of Thrones type stuff. There's this like a pirate, I think his name is Raban, who's the fictional male interest, and the protagonist in this sort of fictional world within the fictional world is a female ship captain. So it's kind of like a gender bending pirate fantasy novel. And there's all these women in the audience at this Barnes and Noble who are clearly like massive devotees. You know, they read all her novels and they worship her. And then they're all lining up to get autographs. And it's kind of has this like, I don't know, fan con type aspect to it where people are bringing props, but then right after that she gets into her limo and you can tell that she's full of self-loathing because she's a very smart person and she realizes that what she's writing is crap, and she has this very funny exchange with the limo driver on that score, and she's there with her
I have it here. I could read. So the limo driver says, "That was quite a send-off. I'm sorry, should I know who you are?" And Carol says, "Depends. You a big fan of mindless crap?"
I thought it was so good. And clearly the creators thought very hard about how to establish character, and they established that she's famous, established that she's a serious person who writes nonsense, that she doesn't really respect herself professionally, and then all hell breaks loose because, you know, the actual plot starts. But it was such a brilliant scene, especially because, you know, when she's signing books, there's this whole parade of people who come, and they're obviously sort of types. Like I'm guessing that every famous novelist, when they do these events, there are certain types of fans. They fall into different categories, and it's really well done.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been to hundreds of those book things, so book signings. So, you know, I was like, oh my God, this is so dead on. I don't know if have you ever been to one of these things before? These
I have. So I was in where was it? Coconut Point, Florida, and I forget, is it Jeff Kenny? It's the guy who does the Diary of Your Wimpy Kid books. I think his name is Jeff Kenny. I don't know if you're a parent or there are parents listening, but there's this series of books called Diary of Your Wimpy Kid that's incredibly popular. And there was a whole bunch of them, and I'm guessing the author made millions and millions and millions of dollars. And it was very humbling because I had just done this is, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. I had just done my book launch for my first book back in Toronto, and I was like really proud of myself because, I don't know, it was like 100 people showed up or 150 or something. And I sold I don't know, maybe 200 books, whatever it was. And I was like all high on myself. And I was at this Barnes and Noble because my kids were huge fans. So we went, and he must have sold 10,000 books. I mean, there were people lining up with like, they couldn't, it was like as many books as they could hold for him to sign. And like thousands and thousands of books must have moved that day. And I think he was on some kind of tour where I'm guessing he did like 3 of these a day. And it was just crazy. Now, this was sort of a different vibe because it was parents who were there with their kids. But yeah, I mean, these things can get very cultish because you spend years reading this author and then you finally meet them. And I mean, I've been to fan conventions here in Toronto, where comic book illustrators are there and stuff. And, actually, there's one, it's actually kind of sad, at the fan con in Toronto, there's one room where you can get autographs with people, but it's done by price. So I remember the actors who played the redhead brothers, the brothers in
Like the Weasley brothers?
yeah, exactly. The Weasley was, and so there's like 5 Weasley brothers or whatever. Anyway, I think they or 3. Anyways, they had 3 of the brothers there, and it was like $150 to get your photo taken and get an autograph with them. And then I think like there was a guy from Doctor Who was like $250, but it was organized by price. So you'd go down this bunch of stalls, starting maybe in like $300, $250 range for, genuine stars, people who were popular. And then by the time you get to the end, you're paying like $20 to have your picture taken with some guy from like Different Strokes or something. Like it was so sad because the prices, obviously, these were market prices, right? And you could tell that these B-list stars were just progressively moving down the chain with every passing year. And there was something very, even my kids thought it was sad. Like so it's sad.
I am a parent, but I have a daughter who's 1 year old, so we haven't gotten to the Diary of a Wimpy Kid stage. Yeah.
Okay. They're actually great. I actually really enjoy them, because as a parent, you have your favorites about what you want to read and what you don't want to read, and I actually found those books very clever. So that's a tip for parents.
Okay, cool. But yeah, I mean, that bookstore scene was just dead on. I mean, like, even like, I mean, the way that the bookstore announcer mispronounces the name of the series, like, I've seen that happen a million times. And then, like, the guy comes up and he's like, well, actually a schooner doesn't have a mizzen mast. And
right.
I'm sure that guy's also a science fiction fan because I've met that guy.
That's one type. And then there's the woman who was complaining. She said, I'm very upset that Raban wasn't on the cover. And I think Carol whispers to her, like, check page 233. And they exchange knowing smiles. And you could just tell she's going to run home and have a very passionate reading experience. The whole thing was hilarious.
And so when you made it your Twitter background, it was just because you thought it was great, or was there anything more to it than that?
No, I did it because I wanted to be on famous podcasts, and I thought I could pay for it. No, so my Twitter background is like whenever I see something funny or interesting or clever, I do it just totally like on a lark. I think before that, my Twitter background was some hilariously campy poster that I saw in a Greek souvlaki restaurant here in Toronto. It was some kind of like take on Greek history but it had nothing, like there were actually Greek people who said, so, what's up? Why are you a fan of this ancient Macedonian king? Or so I don't like, sometimes it's just random stuff. But this was, this was when I was binge watching it because unfortunately there's this, as you know, there's only one season of it. And I don't think we're going to get another season for a while. And as with a lot of binge watching experiences, it's very intense, right? So I think my wife and I, we watched all the episodes in the space of a week or two. And so that's kind of where my mind was at. I really enjoyed the show. I thought it was great. I wish there was another season around the corner, but it sounds like we're going to have to wait.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with the streaming model is that, like in the days of syndication, they would just be, in this constant cycle of turning out new episodes. But now the streamers, usually they have them wait until they see how the first season did before they start working on the second one. So you just get, and the seasons will be like, so you'll watch 10 episodes and then like 3 years will go by before you get the second season. It's really hard to, maintain momentum for something on that kind of a schedule.
I get the economics that you're describing though, because if you've watched it, and it sounds like, and you wouldn't have me on your podcast if you didn't like, or you weren't at least interested in the
Oh,
show.
I loved it. I'll just say, I mean,
Okay.
because a lot of times we'll do review episodes on this podcast, but I didn't really have anything, I just basically liked everything in the show. It's really quirky and it's not for everybody, it's kind of like slow and the
Right.
main character is sort of cranky and stuff. But I loved it. So I didn't really have too many criticisms even to talk about.
So yeah, I loved it, but I can see how the economics of it aren't like a studio exec's going to say, oh yeah, give me 4 seasons, because there's a very I would say indulgent quality to the way it's filmed, where it's almost like the director of photography said, I'm just going to do a 20-minute scene where nothing happens, but it's going to be this incredibly beautiful set of montages of the Panamanian jungle, which as you know, there's a whole episode or almost a whole episode that's devoted to this guy trying to traipse his way northbound through the most obscure parts of the Panamanian jungle. And nothing happens. There's no dialogue, and nothing happens, and he suffers a series of like increasingly horrific encounters with the really dangerous natural obstacles in that area. And I mean, those scenes must have cost millions of dollars to film. And again, nothing happens, no dialogue. It's one guy, and it's not like it's Brad Pitt or anything. I mean, he's a great actor, but I didn't recognize him. And I can only imagine how expensive. And there's dozens of scenes like this, dozens of really beautifully shot, inventively rendered scenes that you look at it, and it's art. Like you're like that. Those Panamanian scenes were, I mean, I consider it high art from the point of view of great television. But like you said, it's not like there's going to be 20 million people who just say, "Oh yeah, give me more scenes from the Panamanian jungle." That's the stuff. That's what I came here for. And so it seems very indulgent from a creative point of view. Like one of those deals where, where these things of Hollywood is like, where the DP is like, I need 7 cameras and I need a budget of 20 million and I need this and I need that. And someone said, yeah, great. Here you go. Go shoot your dream scene. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I'll do it.
I guess we should explain. So this is the new show from Vince Gilligan, who made Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. So it's like basically nobody else in the world would have been allowed to make this show. He sort of like cashed in all his chips to get this thing made.
But brilliant people make shitty shows. Like there's lots of Ishtars out there, and by the way, there's lots of Ishtars out there that were never made because someone said, I don't care how famous you are, we're not making this because it's going to suck. Like sometimes geniuses, we consider them geniuses because people who are not geniuses save them from their follies. So you're right that no one who hadn't had a lot of blockbusters would even be allowed to make it, but it must have been a tough pitch, especially given the fact it basically has one character or two characters if you count the kind of Borg-like joining thing that includes like 6 billion people on the planet in one single hive mind. I'm getting ahead of myself plot-wise, but like essentially there are some other minor characters, and they're starting to kind of becoming more part of the plot. It's like a dozen characters around the Earth who have their own identity. But most of the episodes essentially consisted of 2 characters. One consisting of this one person named Carol Sturka, and the other consisting of a collective hive mind of 6 billion people. Like that must have also been a very... Oh, and by the way, did I mention that the one actual character is like a middle-aged lesbian alcoholic who's incredibly cranky and irritable. Like, so can you give me my money? Can I go do it? Like, and they say yes. I mean, good for that Apple TV for saying yes.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think of the irritable lesbian alcohol? Like, did you, because I think a lot of people, she sort of rubs them the wrong way, but I have a feling you felt some affinity for this character.
What are you saying? No, I did. So she's a great actress. And that's part of it. But it's a hard question to answer because I think she's a great character. She inhabits the character. She sells the character. She feels like a person you could know in the literary world. Not like I know like a ton of famous novelists, but I know some just through my work. And yeah, I mean, a lot of them are really introverted and moody, and sometimes they get angry at the world, and they don't play well with others, especially when the others are this weird sci-fi hive mind. That part was good. I think even the
Actually,
best.
let me just throw in there. So, my wife and I this morning we rewatched that bookstore scene
Yeah,
that you mentioned earlier, and she said something I thought was really clever. But she said, actually, even before the alien hive mind took over, Carol was surrounded by like annoying, cheerful people that she had to just grin and bear it. And so the
right.
science fiction scenario becomes this kind of just exaggerated science fiction version of what her life was like before the science fiction element entered the story.
I didn't even realize how brilliant that scene was from a symbolic point of view till you and your wife what figured that out, because I didn't. That's a very interesting parallel. So interesting that I'm sure it was deliberate, and I appreciated that scene without even having the insight that you just provided. But yeah, she's irritated by being among those people, and she. But the thing is, she found someone she loves. It's her manager slash wife, girlfriend. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
wife. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. And are we allowed spoilers here?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, this
'cause
is full spoil. There will be a spoiler warning in the intro.
okay, so as maybe you said in the intro, like the wife dies almost immediately. And she dies in this like very dramatic way because as part of this transition into the joining into this Borg that all of humanity enters except for a dozen people, there's maybe like it sounds like a quarter or a fifth or a sixth of the people don't make it, and they just they have sort of this epileptic seizure and they just die. And Carol's wife is one of those people who doesn't make it. She just dies. But well, we can get into this later, but there's this horrifying thing where she lived long enough that the Borg kind of copied all of her memories into its collective Borg memory. So one of the interesting plot details is that the Borg, when they're talking to Carol, they're capable of just casually saying to her, "Oh yeah, your wife read this book, but only up to page 120, and she kind of liked it," and like all of these secrets that we all keep some kind of secrets from even the people we love because we don't want to hurt them, maybe sort of like, do I look fat in this dress type thing. But we do that with, if my wife were a famous author and she asked me to read her novel, every novel is great. Yo, fantastic. You're
Yeah.
your best one. Yeah. And then there's this mortifying scene where Carol asks a representative of the Borg, which is to say literally any human on Earth, aside from the dozen people who aren't part of it, what did my wife think about this serious novel? Because she was working on a serious novel.
Her literary novel.
Right. Yeah. Her great was going to be something that broke her out of genre fiction, and the one of the characteristics of the joining, I think that's what it's called, or
Yeah, it's
is
the joining.
they can't lie. So they can't sugarcoat it, or they they're trying to be polite, but it's
I actually have this dialogue exchange written down, so I'll just read it here. So Carol says, "What did Helen think of my unpublished novel?" And the alien says, "Bitter chrysalis." What did she think? Carol, this line of inquiry isn't, "Can we talk about something else?"
right.
I want to know. If you tell me, it'll make me happy. Helen thought it was fine. Fine as in good, or fine as in meh? Yeah, meh. And yeah, go ahead.
They're brutally honest. And by the way, I forgot that the novel was called Bitter Chrysalis, which is such a perfect name for a novel that a genre writer would write to signal like how serious their new work is going to be. There's little details like that which are really good. So that, because I'm not a novelist or a fiction writer, but those kind of little exchanges really sort of hit home for you as a creative, because we're all used to having, what did you think of my latest podcast episode? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I'd be terrified to ask that question to somebody who couldn't lie, because usually when you ask a question to a friend or relative, you nominally want them to be honest, but in the back of your mind, you're also conscious that, there's kind of social conventions that they're not going to say, well, that really sucked, like, so, it would be scary to ask that to somebody who, or in this case, an entity that was incapable of lying.
Yeah. Well, my wife is a fiction writer as well, and so just when the alien says, or when Carol says, "Fine as in good" or "fine as in meh," I was just like, "Oh my god, is Stephanie in the room with me right now?" Like, I just feel
Right. Oh, do you have to read your wife's fiction? Like, sorry, I don't mean it's like a burden, but
No.
it would be very emotionally difficult for me to have to give candid feedback, because I'd be terrified that I wouldn't like it, and then, oh my god, what do I say? What do I, like, so.
Yeah, no, I do, and I do give her candid feedback, and it is definitely, it's just something you have to navigate if you're two, writers living together and, and everything. But it's definitely a challenge.
Good luck with that.
What did you, I guess, did you like the whole season? Did you like everything about the show, or if you were reviewing it, did you have any criticisms?
Yeah. I guess my criticism, which is, I guess, tied up with one of the unavoidable difficulties of the premise, is that establishing motive is very difficult when there's essentially only one character, because motive is essential when you're creating characters and you're trying to develop a realistic plot and trying to get people to suspend disbelief. This is a problem with another show we could talk about, Severance. Although I'm sure you've talked about it on your podcast.
Yeah, we did an episode on it. Yeah.
Okay, my wife and we just binge watched that too. So that's what I might have to change my Twitter screen background, because that's all we're talking. But
I'll say I've only watched season 1 though, so no spoilers for season 2.
We're pretty deep in season 2. But establishing in any kind of sci-fi thing where it's taking you out of the world we know and introducing all these strange and unusual complications to the nature of reality, establishing motive is sometimes difficult, because it's easy to establish motive in the workaday world we live in, like, successful relationships, successful job, and but those things don't have any meaning in a world where there's 12 independently minded humans on Earth. You don't have a job, and how do you establish motive? And the way they establish motive at first is in Pluribus is kind of easy. It's this Carol's in kind of the state of emotional shock, and everything that's happened is horrible. She's just lost her wife. This kind of like wild animals roaming her neighborhood, because no one's living there, and that carries through the first couple of episodes. The state of shock and loneliness and curiosity, like, what's going on? How do I get the world that I knew back? But then as things go on, you're kind of unsure of what her motivations are, because the joining keep, like, one of the interesting, I would say, unique aspects of it is the science fiction villain is kind of like the nicest person you've ever met. All they want to do is make Carol happy. They won't even like kill animals for food, which is why they eat each other once they're dead, like, which grosses Carol out. But they have to for protein, because they can't kill animals. And Carol kind of keeps remaining angry at them. And I remember I was watching I about halfway through the first season, I think I said to my wife, like, why is she still so pissed off at them? Like, she kind of remains constantly furious at them, except for this one representative specimen who's kind of, I guess, what passes for a love interest. And I remember asking, like, this doesn't really make sense. Like, why she would just remain in a constant state of anger at them. Confusion, yes. Disorientation, yes. But
I feel like that's her character, though. Like she was in a constant state of anger even before the aliens came around, and this is sort of just
I guess. But that aspect, it has a one note aspect to it. And I think, especially in sort of, we live in what I think is a sophisticated age of television, that you have heroes and anti-heroes. And I don't even know how to describe Carol Strick, whether she's an anti-hero. Maybe she's an anti-hero. But like, like Better Call Saul, like Saul wasn't always, like, he was kind of a jerk, but he wasn't always a jerk. Like, sometimes he was funny, and sometimes you felt bad for him, and sometimes he was lying and unethical and a grifter. And I would say in this television at that level, we're talking about like Sopranos, you're talking about Severance, you're talking about like high concept TV shows. You kind of expect that the main characters are going to show you something about themselves, displaying a range of emotions. And I did eventually get tired of Carol always being in a state of freaked out anger.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, it didn't bother me personally. Just like when you're describing it, I'm just laughing. It's just funny. Like just how exasperated she is with these aliens all the time. It's just funny to me. But
also, I'm Canadian, and this, I don't mean this as a joke. I mean this like serious. Is that she's extremely rude to them. So they're trying to bring her food and all this stuff, and I can see why she doesn't want to be in a situation where you're dependent on like this creepy space entity that, fired its DNA through a light cannon at humanity and converted it into this collective entity. Like, to be dependent on that kind of weird thing for food and sustenance and survival is it's not a situation you want to be in. But these people are bringing her food, like literally anything she wants, they bring her. They're keeping her alive, really. I mean, she'd probably perish if they weren't helping her live. And she's just like constantly being an asshole to them. And just as a Canadian who's just, at least maybe not online, but in my personal dealings with people, I'm very stereotypical. Like, oh, thank you, sorry. Like it's one thing to be grumpy and a curmudgeon and an introvert and antisocial, and Carol Sturck wrote that. But it's another thing just to be kind of like a jerk and an ingrate. And sometimes her character kind of crosses the line into that.
It sort of reminds me of in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Arthur Dent is always being really mean to the the AI coffee machine and the AI doors and stuff, that they just drive him insane.
The Sirius Cybernetic Corporation.
Yeah.
That show, and the BBC adaptation of it did a particularly good job of it.
That's a British story, obviously. So do you? And British people are sort of famously thought of as being really polite as well, but it is funny, like that sort of exasperated.
Yeah.
And I think he's also he doesn't see the AI coffee machine as really human, and maybe Carol doesn't see the Borg entity as human either.
That's actually a really interesting point. Although the thing is, in the thing with Arthur Dent, because that scene is I think it's the Sirius, if I remember correctly, the Sirius Cybernetic Corporation, and they use an actor with like one of these sort of like the Page from 30 Rock. That actor, it reminded me of that, like just like supernaturally polite and happy even when obscenities are being shouted at him. But ultimately, that was an elevator. Whereas in the case of the Carol Sturcker, she's often being jerky to people who, at least nominally, assume human form. Like although it's kind of funny the way they introduce themselves. Like, hi, I am the I'm the individual formerly known as Joe Smith, or I was formerly the individual known as Jane Doe or whatever. Like, they recognize that they have a past, that they were formerly an individual. They don't self-identify as individuals now. But it's one thing for Arthur Dent to mouth off in an elevator. It's kind of another thing for her to. Again, it is like a minor criticism, but the other thing is there's another character who gets introduced toward the end of the season. This guy who comes all the way up from Paraguay. He's the guy I was mentioning before. Mm-hmm. There's these horrifying, to me, scenes of him trying to get through the jungle. And I didn't know this before I watched the show, but You can drive a car all the way from the tip of Alaska all the way down to the bottom tip of South America, with one exception. There's this gap in Panama. I think it's known as the Damien Gap. It's like 60 or 70 miles or something like that, which is like so remote. I think they've tried to put roads through it, but they can't. And it's full of like tarantulas and these trees with spikes. But in order for him to get to Carol, which he eventually does, he has to traipse through there. And he's the character. He's like Rorschach from The Watchmen. Like he's just, and so he is the ultimate hard case asshole. And for Carol to also be that character is kind of like they're stepping on each other's shoes a little bit. But there's this incredible scene where he drives his car from Paraguay as far, like basically to the entrance of the Damien, I think it's called the Damien Gap. I'd have to look it up. And there's all these people from the joining who are they're like, don't do this. You're going to die if you walk through that jungle. Many have perished. We can take you to Albuquerque. We can take you to Carol. We know where you're trying to go. Like, let us give you food. Let us do this. And he turns to them, and I don't know if you have this dialogue written down because you've already there.
I don't have this one, but I feel.
But do you remember he turns to them and he says, basically, what you were trying to give me is not yours to give. Everything you have stolen.
Yeah.
You don't belong here. You're not one of us. You're all thieves, basically. And then he burns his car and walks into the jungle. And it's like, and but that's him. And we know his motivation. He is, there's something, he's clearly like, his characters, there's something autistic about him. I get the sense that in the second season, he's going to become a big part of it. He eventually gets to Carol and there's some shenanigans, shall we say, ensues, but he's obviously going to be a big part of the show. And what I'd love to see from the next season is if he's going to be the bad cop and the one who has just complete hatred for the joining, and nothing they do or offer will ever change his mind that they are just criminal interlopers on planet Earth, like a kind of a sort of like a flesh virus that needs to be eradicated, like kind of cosmic criminals. Like his hatred knows no bounds. If that's going to be him, and so far that is him, Carol's got to she's got to soften up. But the last scene from the last episode suggests that's not going to happen.
Yeah, well, it'll definitely be interesting. I mean, Vince Gilligan has said he knows, or he has a pretty good idea of where the story's going. I think he has it sort of conceptualized as 4 seasons or so. So, yeah, hopefully, it doesn't just stay the exact same. It doesn't just hit the same note over and over again.
Well, I doubt it will. And by the way, like sometimes people who make these shows, they have the opposite problem where they get writers in the room and say, okay, season 2 is going to be totally different. Like, it's going to be, this is going to be, it's sort of like bands making concept albums, and the Rolling Stones did that, right, where one was kind of completely different from the next in the early part of their career. But I'm not sure I want that either, because I like the show. I don't want it to be a completely different show. I would just like to see some character development. Although, to be fair, there's this very powerful scene where, Carol eventually goes too far and pisses the joining off. She basically, essentially, like drugs a member of the joining, her love interest within the joining, with sort of what is essentially a homemade truth serum, and to get them to divulge their secrets. And it's such an aggressive gesture that the joining, they can't like attack her physically or anything like that, but they all just abandon her geographically. Like they literally, millions of them just leave Albuquerque because they don't want to be around her. And they leave her a phone message because there's no cell phones, but they communicate by landlines. It's kind of, it's a quirk. And they basically, I think this is a recorded message that they keep every time she calls. They say, we still like you, but we need some space. It's like people teenagers breaking up or something like that. And then that's when you do see her really vulnerable side, because then the weeks pass and she's all by herself. And she knows that the joining members she's been with aren't real. They're psychologically, they're not real humans. Like they don't have individual identities, but she still misses being with somebody. And so she begs for them to come back. Somewhat pathetically, she kind of writes out letters on the circular cul-de-sac where she lives, the way you would use stones to write help on a desert island, because they're bringing herself with drones, because they don't want any of them to be in contact with this crazy lady, and then finally, like, she says, please come back. It's an implicit apology, and then she hugs one of them, again, her love interest, and you see there are limits to her hard shell. Like she is still a human. Humans are social creatures. They crave, they hate isolation. They want to be around other people. They get lonely. And she was desperately, desperately, desperately lonely. So much so that she was willing to like just back down and swallow her pride just so they'll come back, so she would have somebody to be with, even if it's somebody who she knows is like kind of a virus robot. Yeah.
Let me ask you, because this sequence where Carol's alone, in particular, like I thought really resonated with the experience that people had during COVID, being stuck at home and only interacting with other people through the internet as this kind of, like group blob of humanity rather than with individual people. And I was wondering, I mean, that certainly struck me watching it. I was wondering if that struck you watching it as well.
So I should be interviewing you, because you and your wife have more interesting insights about the show than I didn't think about that. I mean, what I did get was that Carol's experience of communicating with them and getting information from them is very similar to ChatGPT or AI, in the sense that she even says this explicitly. Well, there's this scene where, so again, there's like about a dozen people on Earth who have not been transformed into the joining, and they all retain their independent identity. And there's a scene, they all meet, I think, in Bilbao, Spain, of all places, because the joining actually flies them all in because they want to meet each other. Like, who are these people who survive the joining and are still human beings? And one of them, I think, flies from India and brings her son, and her son is part of the joining. So you have this woman from, I think, India, if I remember correctly, who's like Carol. She retains her own independent identity, but she's kind of like, she doesn't want to like fight with the joining. She wants to just kind of live her best life in this new weird world. But her son is part of the joining, and it's a painful scene where Carol, the woman is saying, "Oh yeah, well, he's part of the joining, but it's still my son." And Carol says to her, "Like, really? This is still your son? Well, here, let me ask your son." And she asks the son like this really detailed gynecological medical question. Like, it's not X-rated or anything, but it's kind of like this really, you have to be a medical specialist to know. I think she asked, like, how would you use this gynecological instrument to do this kind of operation? And of course he knows and gives this sort of encyclopedic ChatGPT type response. And Carol, it's so cruel. Like, she's demonstrating to this mom, this isn't really your son. This is basically like a ChatGPT with arms and legs. And the response he gives is the same kind of response you would get if you use Google or ChatGPT or anything like that, which is, on one hand, it's incredibly helpful because it's kind of assembling all the knowledge that exists on Earth in one helpful response to you. But on the other hand, it's also like dehumanizing, in the sense that most of us are used to getting information from one person. Like, you go to your doctor and say, what should I do? I have this malady. What should I do? And a person you know and trust says something to you. And there's something more comforting about that than getting what might be a more accurate and authoritative response that's crowdsourced from all the world's doctors. Because again, it's not how the human brain is supposed to operate. We associate information with trust. But when it comes in disembodied form from billions and billions of people, on one hand, it's more accurate. On the other hand, it feels alienating. And so I took those type of scenes as, I wouldn't say a satire, but maybe like a kind of science fiction adapted illustration of the alienating effects, or at least the disorienting effects of living in an AI world where we have all this information. It's kind of a utopia information wise, but it has a kind of disorienting emotional effect on us. And that part I got. The COVID stuff, yeah, that does make sense. And in a kind of echo of that, Carol is heartbroken to find out that the 11 other people uh, have 2 Zoom calls a week, but she's not invited to them. Do you remember that part where she goes to Las Vegas to meet the Playboy? Because one of the 12 guys is this. He's a great actor. He's like all in on the joining in terms of the joining. He's like the funniest. He's comic relief basically.
He's
But
flying around in Air Force One with all these
yeah,
models,
bimbos,
beautiful
yeah,
models. Yeah.
yeah, and he has 7 Lamborghinis each with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. license plates, and he lives in Las Vegas at the Westgate, which is unrealistic because everyone knows you would stay at the Bellagio. But yeah, and he he has them stage these elaborate. So like there's those. So okay, so this is an example of this one scene that's totally unrelated to the plot, and it goes on for like 10 minutes, and it's an incredible scene. And I was talking before about how self-indulgent this is creatively, but he basically tells the joining, I want to stage this pretend kind of like a play where you're all going to pretend we're at a glamorous Las Vegas party and I'm playing in this high stakes poker game and millions of dollars are at stake, and make it so that I win the hand and beautiful women flock to me and it's all very dramatic, and like there's going to be martinis served in fancy glasses, and like this scene goes on forever and it's a brilliant scene. And then what's great is at the end of the scene, when he's won the poker hand, he says, aha, you have, I don't know, you have 3 queens, but I have 3 kings or whatever. Aha, I win the hand. And then his opponents at the poker table, who are all, of course, part of the joining, they're all kind of actors, they start clapping and applauding him. And he yells, no, he says, no, stay in character. and they, oh, right. And they all pretend to be angry, that he's won the hand. And anyway, so he's so, it's kind of interesting because the different characters, again, who've retained their humanity, he's one of them, and the Indian woman is one of them, and this guy from Paraguay is another one of them. They're all case studies in, well, what would be how would you and I react to the situation?
Mm. Well, sort of going back to this idea of, it just feels like, interacting with these aliens sort of feels like being on the internet. One other thing that sort of struck me was that there's no privacy. Like Carol has no privacy basically in this new world. That once she takes a lover from among the aliens, essentially everybody on Earth knows about it. There's no, there's no secrets. There's no privacy anymore. And
it's worse than that though, because when we think of privacy now, it's like, if somebody hacks your phone, they will see what you're doing now, right? But the kind of privacy breach that Carol's experiencing is a 4-dimensional privacy breach, because they not only know everything, all her current interactions with other joining members, because they have all the memories of Helen and all the memories of Carol's parents and, I don't know, ancestors. Like they know all the most mortifying and private things, including things that Carol doesn't know. So there's this one scene, again, you've warned people, no spoilers, but Carol thinks she has found a listening device in the liquor cabinet in her house, and she thinks, oh my God, this is proof that they're malevolent and they're spying on me. And she confronts them and says, what is this? And she says, it looks like an old fashioned kind of spying device. And the Borg has to reluctantly say, well, yeah, it is kind of a spying device, but in fact, it was Helen, your former wife, who installed it in the liquor cabinet, because remember, that was the time you were trying to get pregnant and have a kid. And, clearly Helen suspected that this alcoholic wife of hers, they were trying to get pregnant, was going to go on a bender and have alcohol and it'd be bad for the baby. And obviously Carol herself didn't know about this. And so it isn't just a privacy breach happening in the moment. It's like they know about this thing that happened 10 years before, which is mortifying, and that Carol didn't even know about it. So it's like it's worse than people knowing all your current secrets. They're also knowing your past secrets that are everything that's lodged in the memory of your best friend and worst enemy and every lover you've ever had. They have all that information. Like, I mean, that's some pretty serious compromising, it's the ultimate compromising information. But of course they don't use it. Like they're not, they divulge it reluctantly. In fact, the only reason they told her that was because she was accusing them of spying on her with that device. And so they had to tell her. That's a great scene, but it goes to the privacy angle that you were talking about.
All right. So I also want to get to your book, Panics and Persecutions. Is there anything else you want to say about Pluribus to wrap things up before we move on?
No. In fact, you've given me a lot of food for thought. That because I kind of watched in a bubble. I'm sure you have people on the show who are like, they have TV blogs or like sci-fi blogs, something like that, and they're kind of part of a public discussion about this show. But this conversation we just had is the first time that I've talked about the show with anybody except my wife. So I'm not knowledgeable about any of the kind of like fan lore of the show, or sometimes you watch the show, you go online and people like pick out all these details you would have missed, like, did you notice that his watch was set to an hour earlier than that? Like I don't
apparently there's a bunch of Breaking Bad Easter eggs in the show which all went over my head, but they're there if you
I'm the last person to notice any of this stuff, and I didn't even like Breaking Bad because I found it too violent. See, that's another thing. I guess I do have something else to say about the show, because one of the reasons I don't watch a lot of TV is I hate violence. Like I Breaking Bad is the bathtub scene. I was like, okay, I'm out. Like I tapped out, and I couldn't watch Sopranos. I found it too violent. I couldn't watch The Wire. I don't like violence on TV. I find it upsetting. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to watch this show Pluribus, because remember that scene when they first get infected in the lab with the virus, and it's going to be like, oh, this is going to be like every other sci-fi biohazard show, like guys in white hazmat suits becoming werewolves or vampires, whatever. They're all eating each other. And my wife's going to keep watching because she listens to murder podcasts and she likes all this crap. And she watches Scandinavian shows or autistic people are murdering each other all the time. And she likes it and I don't. And, I'm the wuss. But then I watched it, and instead of like eating each other, they started like making out, and I was like, what's going on? I'm supposed to be terrified here. And there's no violence. Like the show, there's some violence, but it's kind of like Severance. Like Severance doesn't have violence either, which is why I like it. So I think I appreciate that aspect of it, is that these, in a way, they're kind of thrillers, but I use the term loosely, but not violent. So I hope that's a trend, because I think there's too much violence on TV.
Yeah. All right, cool. So let's move on to Panics and Persecutions. This is a book that came out a couple of years ago, since we last talked. So I was curious to get some of your thoughts on it. Do you want to just tell listeners just kind of what is it, basically, for people who haven't heard of it?
Oh, well, this is an artifact from another era, my friend. So Panics and Persecutions, this gave me an excuse to take it off my bookshelf, my vanity bookshelf, where I keep books that I've either written or edited or contributed to. Panics and Persecutions, 20 Tales of Excommunication in the Digital Age. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It came out during the golden age of cancel culture. And these are articles that appeared in Quillette. They're all long form essays. So they're typically like, 3,000 to 7,000 words. And we have one section, Heretics on Campus, which is about academic mobbings. We have one about the world of art. And often it's based on niches. So there's one woman, kicked out of the classics, which Stuart Regis wrote about what happened to him in university when he he wrote something about women in STEM. And he then got recanceled after he wrote a satirical land acknowledgement, although that isn't covered in the book. So he's a double offender. There's a piece here by a wonderful piece here by Brad Cran about the railroading of Stephen Galloway at University of British Columbia, a particular outrage which happened in the mid 2010s, and which just kind of has had this afterlife, which is just totally, it's been a huge upheaval in Canadian literary circles that goes on to this day. So this, I mean, I'm very proud of this book. I was one of the editors, along with Toby Young, who then worked for us, Claire Lehman, my boss, Jamie Palmer, another he's a founding editor of Quillette, Colin Wright, who a biologist who was working for us at the time. So very proud of this book, but it's dated, and I'm kind of glad it's dated, because the problem that this book was meant to address is less of a problem now. And in part, I hope, because of some of the efforts of people who work at Quillette.
Well, let's talk about your essay, because I thought this was really interesting. You have an essay. It's called, where are my notes? Something about
when censorship
is crowdsourced.
Yeah. And the provenance of that essay is kind of interesting. So that essay started out as a speech. I was speaking in Montreal, and I was actually asked to introduce Jordan Peterson at a big event in Montreal, and I I have kind of a nice side hustle as a speaker, because when they have like a very serious speakers at some of these cultural events, they always know they can count on me to do shtick and lighten the mood. And sometimes like I'll manage the Q&A, or I'll be like the MC. Like I'm never the main event because I'm not famous enough. I'm not Jordan Peterson. By the way, Jordan Peterson has gone through different iterations. This was a different iteration of Jordan Peterson than we have now. But it did give me an opportunity to speak to well-dressed people, and this essay that I've written that you're alluding to came out of that speaking event.
Yeah, and so the premise of the essay is basically that, we always used to worry about, like George Orwell, Big Brother, we always used to worry about the government censoring people, and that actually what has happened with social media is just individual communities of artists acting as this sort of censorship machine without any government involvement at all. Is that a fair summary of the?
It's absolutely a fair summary. And now I'm somebody who I went through a heavy Orwell phase. To this day I name drop Orwell, not necessarily 1984, but some of his essays. This is like one of my favorite, The Prevention of Literature. Like he wrote a lot about this kind of phenomenon. But I mention, and I guess this is one of my arguments here, that if you Googled a phrase like Orwell was prescient, or Orwell predicted the future, or something like that, you'll get thousands of references, people arguing that Orwell had a crystal ball and he foresaw what's happening to us now. But that's not really quite true, and in some ways it's the opposite of truth, because as you said, George Orwell, like all of us, was a creature of his era. And in his era, to a large extent, the threat to free speech came from, for the average person, fascism, communism. And it was a completely top-down phenomenon. The idea of Big Brother, aesthetically, it looked a lot like Joseph Stalin, right? Although even Orwell himself, in his essays, where this essay I mentioned, The Prevention of Literature, where he talks about the British literary scene, he mentions that a lot of the de facto censorship in literary circles isn't coming from Joseph Stalin or local, let alone local British politicians or whatever. Like it's peer-to-peer censorship. It's peer-to-peer pressure where there's a party line, and in the interwar period, certainly, like party line in a lot of literary circles in England was very much a pro-Russian party line. Everyone was kind of a Walter Duranty figure. Like they kind of idolized the idea of this grand socialist experiment. But that's not what 1984 is about. 1984 is an extremely rigidly top-down form of censorship, and it's so top-down that, you know, if a single person decides that war is peace or peace is war, or we're at war with, you know, Eurasia instead of East Asia, or whatever, like that's it. That becomes the new truth. Whereas what I was saying was, it turns out we don't need a big brother. Like in Canada, everyone's saying, oh, you know, under Justin Trudeau, Canada became like this Orwellian censorship state. Like, the fact is, the Canadian government was not responsible for the climate, like the sort of, some people call it, I don't think it's a misuse of the word, the totalitarian climate of ideological conformity in Canada. It's all peer-to-peer. It's like, if you want a book contract, or if you want to be like a panelist on some kind of some kind of poetry conference, which I know sounds ludicrous that this is a sort of bauble people are arguing over. But if you're like a Canadian poet, like, this is what you live for, like to be a panelist at, you know, the Halifax poetry meetup. I know it. Look, every professional and cultural ecosystem.
Hey, I'm a short story writer, so right. I get it.
You know, but you know, look, when I talk to normies, they think like, you know, it's like the Banff Literary Festival has canceled so-and-so and has, you know, will not be paying them their $125 honorarium or whatever. And people like, you know, who cares? Like, if you want $125, you know, go work at McDonald's for a weekend. Like, it's like, why are they arguing about this stuff? But as you know, in this world where there isn't a lot of money and it's kind of a zero-sum game in terms of like being on panels and getting awards and getting nominated for things, and like, this is what they live for. These are the gold medals in their status Olympics. And all of the machinery of censorship or of ideological conformity in those universes was absolutely not coming from the government. It was coming from gatekeepers and enforcers within that world who were weaponizing whatever powers they had, whether it was access to, but to be fair, sometimes it meant access to government money. So often, like in Canada, the arts are heavily subsidized, and some arts are essentially exclusively funded by the government. So the government is involved, but not in the way of like a Big Brother type thing. It's these pools of money are made available, and they're put in the hands of ideological enforcers who then restrict access to the funds or to opportunities for advancement to people who they believe are ideologically reliable.
Well, and there are a lot of novelists that I know who lost their careers, you know, over this sort of cancel culture nonsense. And that's not $125. You know, that's like, you know, people were making good livings, you know, and then it just comes to an end overnight. So in the world of podcasting, one of the saddest examples was, do you remember there was a podcast called Reply All? Yeah.
And do you remember there was two guys who ran, like, the podcast kind of self-destructed in a kind of, and it was like, wasn't really like a classic identity politics, like BLM type thing. It was more complicated than that. But that podcast kind of self-destructed. And that was a pretty lucrative podcast. Like, it was about 5 years ago.
Yeah, I took a podcasting class with one of those guys.
But one of them, basically, it ended his career. Like, it was because one of them was like very quirky and funny, and it was PJ Voigt, was that his name? And the details are very hazy in my mind. But it was a podcast I actually listened to, and I remember, like, kind of overnight it self-destructed because of, like, there was an argument about unionization, and he and that was it. Like, that was it. His career was over. Or you had that woman who was going to become the editor of, was it Teen Vogue or something? And then they found out she had some racist anti-Asian tweets, and that was, her career basically ended. And there was a whole bunch of this stuff, but none of these things involved government. None of these things involved Big Brother. It was like, Big Brother, c'est nous. You know, we're Big Brother. And if the cancel culture phenomenon has really brought out the fact that this is lodged within our instinct, this kind of deeply tribal desire to sort people into good and bad categories.
Well, let me, because that's what I want to ask you. Speaking of George Orwell, is because you sort of, and this was news to me, but you sort of present this idea that in Orwell's day, if you said anything negative about the Soviet Union, you would get ostracized or blacklisted.
Within those circles, yeah.
So is cancel culture new, or is it just the same as it ever was?
No. So it's the same as it ever was from a human psychological phenomenon. And by the way, like, if anything, it was 100 times worse. Like in the 17th century, Protestants and Catholics literally butchering each other, during the 30 Years' War because they worshipped the Christian God the wrong way. Like, if you look at the incredible bloodshed that's been shed just in the Christian era. I mean, forget going back, to the pre-Christian era. Like, people slaughtering each other for reasons that are at least as stupid as, well, you didn't have a Black Lives Matter square on your Twitter feed, so we're canceling you. Or because, they're arguing about what prayers to say in church, or and every religion has this, like, Shiites and Sunnis. So, like, yeah, I mean, this is a universal thing. I think historians, sociologists and historians, when they look back at what we now call cancel culture, I think what they will focus on is the use of social media as an accelerant, as a turbocharging mechanism for this innate tribalizing, sadistic human impulse we all have to try and make people think like us. Because I was just having this discussion with somebody that, when I was a kid, not even when I was a kid, when I was in law school, like in the late 90s, you could work with somebody for years and years and years and have no idea of their political views. A person could be what we would now call like a social justice warrior or a white supremacist, or they could be a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, and they could be the person in the next cubicle, and you could go to lunch for them. And if they didn't talk about politics, there was who knows what they thought, and you might not care, but it was possible to create a firewall between what you thought about religion and politics, the two things you're not supposed to talk about at dinner parties, what they thought about religion and politics, and what they thought about, like, the second quarter financial results for the corporation you both work at, which is the only thing you discuss at work. And then suddenly, thanks to social media, you could look on that guy's Facebook or Twitter account or Tumblr or whatever you were using, and it was like Free Palestine, or Long Live Zionism, or I love Trump, or I hate Trump, or Black Lives Matter is awesome, or the opposite. Like, suddenly, and then you could look at their feed, you could look at every single thing they tweeted for the previous 10 years and have this, we were talking before about Pluribus. Suddenly you had this like encyclopedic knowledge of at least every political conviction that they thought it was appropriate to publicize, that they freely publicize, right? This isn't a privacy breach. This is them telling us everything they think, going back to when they were a teenager in many cases. And because often we've seen examples of people being canceled for like things they joked about when they were like 17 or something. And that is new. And so if you combine that with what we're talking about, this inveterate human urge to classify people as either good or bad, and if you're bad, you're canceled. Like, I'm a Catholic, you're Protestant, or I'm Protestant, you're Catholic. I'm good, you're evil. I want you out of my town, out of my village, certainly out of my church. I don't want you teaching my kids because they'll think, you're an evil heretic, and I don't want, like, combine that impulse with, because it used to be to find out if somebody's a witch, you had to like throw them in a lake and see if they float or whatever. But now you don't have, like, that's messy and exhausting. Now you can just say, well, 7 years ago you tweeted this joke about how, Asians are always stinking up the microwave at work. And so, like, I think that's the new thing. The social media and social media isn't new, but it was obviously in the late 2010s that it was like everybody had a social media account. And yeah.
Well, so let me ask you though, because I mean, you're saying, well, the problem was that social media made it so that people knew other people's political opinions. But what sort of blows my mind looking back is that, so I found out there was this, in 1968 in science fiction, there was this thing where a bunch of science fiction authors who were in favor of the Vietnam War. They took out a full-page ad in Galaxy magazine expressing support for the Vietnam War. And some anti-war authors found out about that, and so they took out an ad on the facing page, and there were a long list of signatories on both in both ads, either supporting or opposing the war. And the Vietnam War obviously was as contentious a political issue as anything today, and nobody was blacklisted or fired or ostracized or anything. It was somehow possible in that era to disagree.
That's very interesting. Although, so what strikes me is two different things. One thing is that maybe the reason no one got canceled is because they had like a balance of power thing. Because it sounds like they both had numbers, so it wasn't like a 80-20 thing. But the other thing I'm thinking of, which is a totally self-interested thing as somebody in the journalistic profession, is how awesome it is to be a guy selling advertisements in those days. I'm old enough to remember when newspapers and magazines were profitable. But let's say you're the ad director for that magazine, and they come in and say, 100 people come in and say, we want you to print, here's $20,000 or whatever. Well, maybe Galaxy magazine, maybe like $500. Here's, I love that it's called Galaxy magazine, but here's $500, print this ad about how we support the Vietnam War. And then your first phone call is to the folks on the other side saying, hey, you know who just paid me $500 for an ad? Is these guys, these warmongers who like the Vietnam War. Are you gonna stand for that? And they're like, okay, reserve the opposite page. Like the only person who wins there is the person selling ads. But I'm guessing that supporting the Vietnam War must have at least had a semi-popular constituency within the arts community, or they wouldn't have taken that. By the way, people forget university administrators, like obviously writers are considered a sort of leftist constituency. Until like the 70s or even 80s, like university administrators, in defiance of the stereotype, now they were considered a conservative constituency. They were the ones cracking down on like kind of 1960s sort of hippie professors and stuff like that. And so, like we just take it for granted now that everybody in the arts industry, everybody in academia, like in perpetuity, going back through history, it was always a highly progressive, pacifistic, social justice constituency. But that's actually not true. And I don't know about the world of science fiction and genre writing in general, although I'm guessing science fiction might be a little bit more at least back then, ideologically diverse than, some of the politicized circles that George Orwell was talking about, because it's mostly men, like, not to be stereotyped, but back then, most sci-fi writers, like middle-aged white guys who, like, maybe were kind of representative of the sort of split between Democrats and Republicans, I'm guessing.
Well, it's interesting what you say about maybe there was this balance of power in that period. I mean, that could well be true. I mean, because it seems to me, based on my reading of the history of science fiction, is that there was actually a pretty strong degree of right-wing censorship.
Oh, yeah.
From like 1930 through 1970. Say.
Well, remember the comic book code?
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't depict sex in comics. And like, look, there's a lot of sci-fi writers who, if you look at what they're writing about, it's like often kind of either highly libertarian, which is fine, but often they use their discussion of like life on other planets as sort of their modeling what in their mind might be an idealized society. Like the political ideas of, if you look at George Herbert and Dune, like George Herbert had some really weird political.
Frank Herbert.
Frank Herbert. I don't know. Apologies to George Herbert. I don't know who he was. Like actually, we published a great essay about like Frank Herbert was. First of all, I think Dune is completely overrated. It's purple prose, and I don't know why it's popular, but he himself was a crackpot, and a lot of sci-fi writers. If you scratch the surface, have weird views, which, by the way, I kind of like.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors is Philip K. Dick. So I mean, you don't get much more weird views than that.
But I like that. Like, I don't. I like it. I don't like his views. I like the fact that, like, unless you have a certain latitude for crackpots and weirdos with eccentric and sometimes even offensive views, you're not going to get a Philip K. Dick. You're not going to get, like, you need a playground for those people to make a mess with their ideas, and so that one out of 100 can actually bloom into into something that approaches a work of genius.
Well, let me say, I mean, recently I interviewed Robert Charles Wilson. He's a Canadian science fiction author, but he was talking about when he entered science fiction in the 70s. He described it as a, quote, teapot bohemia, which I think really captures really well what the atmosphere was like in science fiction in the 70s. And nobody would describe anything related to publishing today as any sort of bohemia.
No, well, the other thing is, if you're doing genre fiction now, you're completely dependent on things like YouTube and social media. You yourself might not be highly politicalized or ideologically driven, but actually, this is particularly true in the YA, young adult field. Like the young adult fiction field was one of it went the craziest in terms of things like having sensitivity readers, and actually, I think one of the essays we have here in Panics and Persecutions was about some of the meltdowns that happen in YA, because all of that, the YA stuff, basically social media makes or breaks these books. And if social media, if the main forums turn against you, you could have an army of publicists pushing a book. It doesn't matter. Like the book's going to die.
Well, like if you listen to my interview with Kat Rosenfield, she talks about how she tweeted like the most mild pushback against cancel culture and immediately was completely blacklisted from YA publishing, and like noticed her editor had like unfollowed her or blocked her or something on Twitter. It was just insane. Yeah.
Why? And because like, no surprise, YA, you're catering to 20-year-old internet addicts. So like, yeah, of course, 16, 18, 20. So those are the people who are going to be in channels that are the most febrile. And like a lot of this doesn't even go to the politics of the people making decisions. It goes to the politics of the market, of that being catered to by the people making decisions.
Well, I'm really skeptical of the idea that it's being driven by financial considerations. I mean, what I've seen is that I think it's being driven by editors, posturing on social media. Whereas readers like don't know or care about,
No, but the YA thing is different. Don't you think the YA thing is different? Because that is a ground up phenomenon where I get the sense that the YA market is highly online. But I agree with you when it comes to, there's a lot of what you say I think is true. I think YA, simply because it's so online, or movies,
I think financially relevant numbers of people just don't pay attention or care. The people who care are big on social. They make a lot of noise on social media, but in terms of like dollars, they're completely irrelevant.
Have you seen The Studio with Seth Rogen?
I haven't seen it. I saw it was you mentioned it in your tweet, but I haven't seen it. No.
So I've had my issues with Seth Rogen in the past, but it's a brilliant show. And there's a whole episode devoted to casting, which I think gets to what you're saying exactly. So if anybody listening to this, watch, because they're making this ridiculous movie. It's called The Kool-Aid Movie. The premise of The Studio is Seth Rogen is the head of the studio, and it's kind of a send-up of Hollywood. And the centerpiece case study, they're making a Kool-Aid movie, which will feature the Kool-Aid Man as the hero. Like, it's a totally stupid sounding movie. But then there's one point where they're casting the Kool-Aid Man, and it's like, oh, should the Kool-Aid Man should he be black? Should he have a black voice? Or would that be racist? And like, they go around and they find like the one guy in the studio in their one black colleague and say, hey, and they try get him, get his badge of approval about whether their casting decision isn't racist, but he's kind of on the fence. And so, but of course, everyone who's making the decision is white. And it's a situation where it goes to your point where the audience you're watching if I'm watching Zootopia or something like that, I don't come out of Zootopia and say, oh my God, only 17% of the voice actors are actors of color. But in that Hollywood world where they're all looking around a table and they all want to be the most enlightened person in the room, you're right. They're posturing for each other. They're not posturing.
I talk to normal people who read books, and half the time they're like, oh, have you read this book? It's great. And I'm like, who's the author? And they're like, oh, I'm not sure. Or if they know the author's name, they don't know if they're alive or dead, anything about them. Certainly not, they don't know about some like stupid internet controversy from 8 years ago. You know, like the number of people who pay attention to that is just minuscule in my experience.
I think you're right. I'm not an expert on YA. I got the sense, like sometimes the reason I get that sense is because in those YA controversies, when people were, say, tweeting about it, like some of the tweets got it with like 25,000 retweets or something. Like it seemed to be a mass phenomenon, as opposed to, you know, some of the mobbings we talk about in this book, like Canadian literary mobbings, where it goes to your point, where often both the people being attacked and the people doing the attacking are complete unknowns to the general public. It's just a pissing match within a highly esoteric subculture, and the dynamics there are really just players within that subculture doing power plays to each other, and often not even pretending to care about what the general reading public cares, because there is no general reading public. Like often it's novels and poetry that like no one reads anyway. It's just a question of who gets the grant to actually publish the thing and put it between two covers so they can take a selfie with it in, you know, at their bookstore signing. but the bookstore isn't actually. No, I'm not joking. I think
no, I know. No, I'm laughing because it's true.
The average Canadian book, the last data is something like 250 copies or something. And the median Canadian book, because like Margaret Atwood dragging everybody up, the median Canadian book probably sells something like 100 copies. So like there is no, they don't have to care about the market because often there is no market. Well, I didn't come to talk about the studio, but shout out to the studio. It's actually a very funny show.
Well, actually, speaking of Margaret Atwood, so I remember this thing on Twitter around 10 years ago. And I was really kind of annoyed at the time because I had just recently interviewed Margaret Atwood, and it was a big sort of coup for me. And I put it in my bio and our show description and everything. I was really proud. You're
gonna put me in the bio too, right?
Yeah. Well, of course. Yeah.
Cool.
And then all of a sudden, it was like everybody on Twitter like hated Margaret Atwood, and it was just like Margaret Atwood's the worst. She's old. She's out of touch. She just said this stupid, offensive thing. We all hate her now. I'm taking my copy of The Handmaid's Tale and putting in the wood chipper, like fuck Margaret Atwood. And I had no idea what was going on. But now I know since I read this book. So can you talk a little bit about why that whole thing happened?
So I mentioned this briefly en passant before, where there was this guy named Stephen Galloway. He was the head of the creative writing department at UBC, at its Vancouver campus to be specific. Like picture UCLA, like the Canadian UCLA, like a sort of the biggest university on the West Coast, or Berkeley or something, like, you know, a major creative writing department at a name brand West Coast Canadian university, top 10 university. And he had this plum job. He had just written, but he'd written a famous novel called, I think, The Cellist of Sarajevo, translated into like 20 languages, which is 19 more languages than your typical Canadian novel. And it was a big deal. And he had an affair with a woman. He was married. She was married. They had an affair. He ended the affair. She then claimed she had been raped. Like her stories were crazy. Like, she claimed she had been raped on a boat. She also claimed she had been raped in his office during his office hours. Like the stories didn't make any sense. They were false accusations. He's now, by the way, subplot, he's now suing her for defamation. That's been going on.
Well, and it was like she claimed she'd been assaulted in his office and then assaulted in his office again. And then she'd been hanging out with him on his boat and got assaulted again. It would raise like red flags for any normal person listening to this story.
And you don't need to take our word for it because he got a hold of all the text messages. So there's documentary evidence. Like these were false accusations, but they were taken at face value at the time. I forget, 2014, 2015, 2016, I forget the timeline. It's been about a decade. And they were immediately like all his friends, all the people who 15 minutes before had been sucking up to him because he was a big cheese at the UBC creative writing program. They all turned on him. He was a monster. The UBC administrators put out a press release which suggested he was a predator and that nobody was safe on campus if he was lurking around the parking lot. He was banned from campus. Of course, he had a psychological meltdown. He was actually at an event in the United States at the time, and I think he was institutionalized for a day because I think the university actually called the police, and the whole thing was insane. And the accusations were false. He never raped anybody. The whole thing was, he did have an affair, which was, a scummy thing to do. And the whole thing was sordid, but certainly not criminal. And the university has never apologized. They had to do a payout to him because of the way they treated him. He was immediately fired. But getting to your question, it immediately became this thing in Canadian literary circles that we have to pretend that Stephen Galloway is a monster. Like, even when the facts came out and it became clear that, like, these accusations were ludicrous and this woman was kind of nuts, and then everything about it her story made no sense, it was still kind of this unwritten rule that if you want to be a member of the Canadian literati in good standing, you had to pretend that Stephen Galloway was a monster and deserved to be fired from UBC and that no one should have any contact with him. And anyone who breached that, or even who said, well, can we at least have some due process before we cancel this guy, was history's greatest monster. And Margaret Atwood was one of those people. She didn't say, I love Stephen Galloway, he's the best. If I remember correctly, she kind of said what any normal, reasonable person would say, which is, trial first, verdict later. And for that, you had this febrile group of largely talentless hacks who the only reason anybody's ever heard of them is because they went absolutely cuckoo bananas on social media about this issue and postured as Canada's greatest feminists because they were trying to defame this guy. And if I sound angry, I am, because like the whole thing was an absolute witch hunt.
But so the thing that really bugs me with this whole Margaret Atwood thing is that, this blew up huge on Twitter. I feel confident that anyone who was involved in writing or publishing in any way who was on Twitter at the time would have seen this story. And if I had not read this book, Panics and Persecutions, I think I would have just been left with this vague sense of like, oh, Margaret Atwood said something offensive or something once upon a time. And I would not have known that, oh, actually, Margaret Atwood was advocating for due process in the case of someone who turned out to have been falsely accused. And nobody, out of all the people who retweeted this story and everything, nobody ever made any effort, as far as I'm aware, to clarify that fact.
No. Well, just the opposite. A lot of this is a little bit of time travel because so much has changed. But this was a period when the idiom that was used to describe these things was one of injury and violence, which is to say that, Margaret Atwood is hurting people. Margaret Atwood is silencing the testimonials of people who suffered sexual assault. Margaret Atwood is insulting the pain of this woman who had allegedly endured all of these improbable rapes at the hands of Stephen Galloway. Like, the very idea of debating due process was foreign to this kind of conversation because it was all a conversation about like pain and suffering and are you on the side of victims or survivors of sexual assault, or are you on the side of the patriarchy or whatnot? And like, to even talk about due process gets to sort of a level of analysis and intellect that was just not part of the conversation. And the people who were the ringleaders of the false accusations against Galloway liked it that way because they lose the argument once it's in the arena of things, due process and proof and evidence and innocent until proven guilty and whatnot. But it's sort of like that, that old Simpsons joke, your tears say more than actual evidence ever could. Yeah. Which is kind of, now, normal people don't really think that way, but if you're in a treehouse club, which like the thing about all of these cancel club, the worst stories from the cancel culture era generally took place within little cultural ecosystems where a very small group of enforcers could impose their will on the majority. Like we have some stories in Panics and Persecutions of like knitting clubs, like knitting, like with needles, like what your grandmother used to do. Like those things blew up.
So one of the essays I particularly wanted to highlight from the book, obviously, it's called "The Troll Who Terrorized Science Fiction" by Kathy Young.
Yeah.
I don't know if do you remember the details of this essay, or is there anything you want to say about it?
So I edited the book, but this was a long time ago. So Kathy Young is a fantastic writer. I'm going to admit,
I can give you a capsule.
Sure. I actually don't remember the essay.
Yeah. So this in science fiction, there was this blogger who made a point of basically accusing everybody of being racist, and just destroyed all sorts of communities and caused a great deal of fear and acrimony, and whose rhetoric was really, really overheated. So this is an example of something that this blogger wrote about an author that she disliked.
Oh, wait. Is this a Sridu Engchow? Yeah. I remember. Okay, yeah.
She wrote, "If I see him being beaten in the street, I'll stop to cheer on the attackers and pour some gasoline on him. Let him be hurt, let him bleed, pound him into the fucking ground. No mercy." And so, yeah. And I guess it turned out that this anonymous blogger was actually a fairly well-known up-and-coming science fiction author. And yeah, and there's like a... Yeah,
but it was one of these things where they were basically prosecuting grievances against other writers under cover of this social justice stuff, right?
Yeah, well, so there were two aspects of this story that I particularly wanted to highlight, and one of them is that if you look at the authors that this person targeted, they were not like conservative authors or right-wing authors. They were people who were really deep in the social justice world themselves and who would care. And who would be potentially, whose reputations would potentially be harmed by accusations of racism, and so it seems that this blogger targeted people who she perceived as professional rivals. People who, right, if they lost their careers, she would move up a notch in the hierarchy. Which
that's, I think that's an aspect. That's an aspect of it, and also it's the aspect of people always hate apostates more than they hate heretics, right? So the people who were subject to the worst were often people in the social justice scene who are seen to be deviationists, or why, like Jesse Singal was attacked mercilessly and continues to be attacked for his cover story in Atlantic. This is like going back years about like the trans stuff. The idea is if this if he had published his article in a right-wing magazine, they wouldn't have cared. But as soon as it was like Atlantic magazine, New York Times, it's like, well, this is supposed to be our turf. And Jesse's supposed to be a good liberal. So I find that's often a feature, is that the circular firing squad is often, it's aimed at people who are supposed to be good card-carrying ideologues and who are seen to stray. And they're the most vulnerable because they themselves have built up their fan base among true believers. And so when you accuse them of heresies, they're much more vulnerable to those accusations than like somebody like me. I mean, I retweet it because it's good for my brand. But if they get accused of it, it goes straight to the heart of their base, right?
Yeah, and I felt like you like just going back through history, if you look at witch trials, a lot of times people who were accused of being witches, it's like their neighbor wanted their property or something.
Oh, or they were like, there was that guy. There's been many great books about the Salem witch trials, but yeah, a lot of it was romantic grievances, jealousy among, small towns, right? Like people know each other's business and they have long memories. It's a feature of unfortunately, of all these things. People are very good at finding pretexts for fighting old battles, like repackaging it ideologically and, as you said, advancing with their organization. I mean, there was a period, I don't know if it's still the case, but there was a period just a couple of years ago if you were like kind of a middle performing professor within, say, I don't know, like astrophysics. I did a huge expose on this woman in the astrophysics field. She wasn't a huge star academically, but if you remake yourself as, I am a pioneer of anti-racism within astrophysics, like suddenly your name recognition goes like shoots above people who've been in the field for 30 years and published many books, and you're the one being invited on at panels and being feted at conferences and doing TED Talks. Like this woman, actually, who I profiled, actually did do a TED Talk, even though, like, from an actual publication record point of view, she was like a total also ran. I don't know if that's still the case, but she was able to shoot ahead of all her colleagues at the University of New Hampshire on that basis. So it became like a career power move.
Yeah, and so then the other aspect of this blogger case I wanted to highlight is that apparently if you look back through her history, she started out being awful to people in a sort of apolitical way, and then at a certain point realized that social justice rhetoric was just like it was like the one ring. It was like the ultimate weapon for bullying people. But that this pattern of bullying preceded the social justice. It was,
Well, there is that. What's that study? I mean, people on the right always cite it, that so-called dark triad personality traits are heavily associated. I don't know how much stock to put in that because, you're always seeing these things like, study shows that conservative political views are correlated with all these awful things. But this study often gets cited, which is that dark triad personality traits are associated with doctrinaire social justice enforcers, which to me is credible because some of the tactics that were used were so obviously antisocial and aggressive and sometimes sadistic that it's not unreasonable to observe that, like, these are underlying tendencies these people have, and this gave them a kind of veil of righteousness in order to prosecute these things. And but yeah, I don't want to generalize. I'm sure there were people who started out in the social justice movement who thought they were on the side of angels, and just got swept up in it. And people are social creatures. Like people often just do what their neighbors do, and if their neighbors say, we're all grabbing torches and we're burning this guy's house down, and you're like, well, okay, I guess that's the thing to do. Like it's just kind of the way the human mind works. But like I said, thankfully, I think some of these manias crested, but every generation has to learn these lessons for themselves. Like, there's so many historical comparisons, right? It was whenever these things happen, and this book, Panics and Persecutions, is full of the, it's like, the Maoist struggle sessions, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, the kind of phenomenon in Britain that Orwell described. Like, and these are just 20th century examples. There's all sorts of examples from history, but it's like every generation has to learn this for themselves. And 15 or 20 years from now, there'll be some new kind of cancel culture because, again, I do think it's a generational thing. Fortunately, in my generation, it seems to have crested and passed. Again, hopefully with some assistance from me and my colleagues at Quillette.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that the worst of the hysteria has died down. But I mean, I know so many people who had their whole careers that they spent decades building, just lose them. I mean, there's a bunch of people who took their own lives who obviously are never, going to recover.
And there are also people who became so scarred by it that they regained their careers, but it kind of went to the other side of the spectrum. Like Brett Weinstein is an example of this, who, he's a guy who was mercilessly hounded at Evergreen State University by social justice mobs. And then it clearly like cracked him in some way, which is understandable. It must have been traumatic. And then sort of started talking about like anti-vax theories. And unfortunately, I know some examples like that, is that when people get attacked by mobs, one reaction is to appease the mob and to try to become holier than the Pope. And, or, you just identify a new target. You say, well, let's go after that person. Stop talking about me. Let's go after this. But then there's another reaction, which is like you're so horrified by it that you become the opposite. Like you become radicalized on the other side of the spectrum, and we have seen examples of that. And also, to be fair, you are, we always copy the bad habits of our worst enemies, and in Trump's America, at least, we've seen examples of right-wing cancel culture. It's this universal human impulse to get everybody to think the way you do, and it's deeply anti-liberal. That's why I try not to avoid using terms like woke and stuff, because it's sort of, the term I use is illiberal. So I'll say like social justice inspired illiberalism or conservative illiberalism. The idea that liberalism is sort of, due process, free speech, civil liberties, presumption of innocence, all that stuff. And that's kind of my creed. And the threat to that, we've been talking about the threat to that from the left that manifested in the late 2010s and crested. But in the United States, you're seeing it on the right. So it's not going away.
Yeah, and I mean, Kat Rosenfield is still blacklisted from YA Publishing, as far as I know. So I don't want to be too rosy about it. I think. So I guess I only see the success, right? Like you're talking about Kat Rosen. So what I don't see is the books that she hasn't written because of the phenomenon you talk about. What I do see is like, oh, Kat's on this podcast, or Kat wrote this article, or So I guess maybe I'm putting too rosy a gloss on it because unless you're friends with the person and see them on a regular basis, you don't know the opportunities they've lost. All you see is the public facing aspect, which is often, like, unless they've been completely canceled, they're still in the public eye to some extent. So you're right. I'm ignorant of the opportunities these people have lost and continue to lose. Yeah, I mean, 99% of people who got canceled just lost everything and have vanished off the face of the earth. And you don't hear about them because they've lost any sort of public platform that they used to have.
Yeah, no, it's true. And Stephen Galloway's he's a salesman. Like he was once one of Canada's most renowned men of letters, and now he's in the retail trade. So he's an example.
Yeah. I mean, just what you were talking about with dark triad personality traits. I mean, I would definitely, if you're going to be in any artistic or left-wing community and you don't know what a cluster B personality disorder is, you need to learn that ASAP, because you're going to run into these people and you need to learn to avoid them at all costs.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know this about me, but I used to be the editor-in-chief at a fairly prominent left-wing Canadian magazine that was part of the sort of recherche arts and letters crowd in Canada. I was kind of a fish out of water because I'm not like a poet or anything. I was kind of a journalistic hack who ran the place for I guess 2 years, and I was kind of shocked at and I don't want to say like, oh, I was surrounded by dark triad narcissists. Like there are people in that space, but what I was shocked with, so the people I was surrounded with, there was a lot of poets, or call them poets manqués, sort of English lit majors, people who were working on novels. They were also editors and journalists, like a lot of them wore multiple hats. A lot of them wanted to be academics. They were deeply connected in the art scene. We ran a lot of fiction, and like that's when I kind of got to know Margaret Atwood, or work with her a little bit through that scene. I kind of got swept up in that scene a little bit too, because it's like, oh, I get to go to these fancy parties and meet novelists and stuff. And but what I will say, I can't say that the people I worked with, many of them like very smart people, very nice people, very gracious. They put up with my quirks. That there was a lot of emotional vulnerability. Like there's a lot of self-selection in those spaces. People who are trying to work out a lot of issues they have, they're very emotionally vulnerable. Some of them are struggling with mental health. There's a well-known correlation between kind of like artistic genius and sort of mental health issues, where, a lot of great novelists and artists are battling sort of inner demons and stuff. And there's some truth to that. And what I noticed was often when there was any kind of political controversy, they would come to me and they were extremely nervous because they worked in spaces that were controlled by the type of personality type you're describing. And there were all these like very toxic personality types in, say, the Canadian poetry scene, especially, or the Canadian fiction scene. And there were two factors there. One is that the dark triad people who were trying to control those spaces ideologically were especially vicious. And the people they were controlling were especially emotionally vulnerable because they might have been drawn into the world of fiction because they had a tormented, traumatic life, and they were using the confessional nature of like some great novel they were working on, or short stories, or creative writing in general, to like work out all these issues they had. And so, yes, you had the dark triad types, but you also had this very vulnerable group of people who had gone into these creative spaces precisely because they were trying to work out all their traumas and stuff. And so it was so toxic. And I was mostly an observer to it, but I was the boss. I was the editorial boss there. And so, like, you know, if I tweeted something that was off message ideologically, they would get very upset. And I think at the time I was very insensitive about it. Like, I had just come from the newspaper world where it wasn't a big deal. Like, this was well before George Floyd and all that stuff. And we didn't really care what the other people were tweeting and stuff. As long as you showed up to work and did your job. Like, this was the mid 2010s. The Great Awakening hadn't really happened yet. And then I came to this literary magazine, and suddenly, like, it was the panopticon. You know, we were talking before, I was talking about how there's no Big Brother. It's Big Brother is crowdsourced. And these people I was working with, the magazine was called The Walrus. It was a terrible name. Were victimized by this panopticon. Like, and this was before cancel culture. Like, I should have taken, like, I saw their world as super weird, but in a way it was ahead of its time, because that was the world that 5 years later, people like Barry Weiss at the New York Times were living through. Like, that world came for mainstream media in the heady days of COVID and George Floyd. And remember, James Bennett was fired from the op-ed page around the time Barry Weiss was defenestrated. So I saw this world I was observing at this magazine as being very unrepresentative of the media world in general, but that would change.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too negative. I mean, all my friends are basically writers, you know, people I know through science fiction. They're, you know, all my favorite people on earth. So I don't want to.
But don't you think that personality-wise, these writers are more emotionally vulnerable, like, than sort of the average person you meet on the street, and are more susceptible to bullying because of that?
Yeah, for sure. But the point I was going to make, though, is that, you know, there's like the great people and there's the, you know, narcissistic, drama-prone, like soul vampire people. And you really have to, it's like a vital survival skill if you're going to be an artist, is to learn to recognize the vampire soul-sucking people and just kind of steer clear of them.
What's weird is the vampire soul-sucking people are rarely the very successful people. Like Margaret Atwood, whatever you think of her views, is absolutely, like, she's a really nice woman. It's often the B-listers who are just filled with resentment that they're not A-listers who become the real sociopaths. Because they're like, actually, I remember at the height of the furor over Margaret Atwood, you had these Canadian writers like literally writing, "It is so unfair." I went into a Barnes and Noble, or I went into an Indigo, and there was like a whole wall of of books about by Margaret Atwood, like that whole display. And my books were relegated to like a small pile, like off in the corner. And like, what gives her the right to take a whole wall? And like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, are you insane? Like, there's a whole wall of books there because people want to buy them. Like, I know that's a concept deeply unfamiliar to you, but it became like it was sort of the kind of narcissism we're talking about became, it blurred into a kind of socialistic political ideal where it's somehow unfair or unnatural that there's any kind of hierarchy of talent or popularity among writers, which, to be fair, is kind of like channels a deeply Canadian
Well,
idea about like excellence. And
it's funny, actually, so I mentioned, going back to Pluribus for a second, that my wife and I watched that bookstore scene at the beginning, and I was like, oh, that's just so dead on. Like, they captured it perfectly. And my wife said, well, it was a little unrealistic that none of the people in line started talking about their own writing.
yes, or had manuscripts. When I do speaking events, I say, always beware the guy wearing a tweed jacket over a t-shirt and wearing tennis shoes with a big sheaf of papers in his hands. Because that sheaf of papers, it's either a record of his litigation against his neighbor for the last 20 years and he wants to write a story about it, or it's a novel. But either way, you should absolutely not talk to him.
Yeah, but professional jealousy is obviously huge in any sort of artistic community, and if you're looking to assign a motivation to anything, jealousy is probably one of the first things on the list that you should consider.
And also consider that, to some extent, this is just a displacement of media channels. Like, there are all these famous exchanges of letters, often like highly barbed, featuring like Norman Mailer and that whole crowd, in like New York Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement. And these literary feuds, which were also propelled by jealousy, they often played out as correspondence in literary journals. And like, I'm a subscriber to the New York Review of Books. There are occasionally barbed letters that appear, but like the letter section of the New York Review of Books is completely dead now, because anybody who wants to take down the big dog goes on social media. But like, you don't have, like, 50 years ago, you had to be Norman Mailer to prosecute these feuds, because these magazines weren't interested in publishing letters from nobodies. But now, like, imagine 50 years ago if there were these literary feuds playing out in these magazines, but like anybody could write letters and be published. Like, every edition would be 800 pages and just but now you can, because of social media. And also, like in the case of the science fiction controversy that Kathy Young wrote about for Panics and Persecution, well, for Quillette, republished in Panics and Persecutions, you can even write it anonymously. Like, New York Review of Books would never publish like an anonymous letter about why, Salman Rushdie sucks. Like, but you can on the internet. And so part of it is just the democratization of media, which allows anybody to prosecute these feuds. And then again, it's a subject of resentment that the spirit of democratization isn't extended to like bookstore displays. It's kind of sad. It was a woman named Alicia Elliott. She actually published like a memoir that was reviewed favorably in the New York Times about 5 years ago. But she was one of the social justice. I mean, she kind of became the social justice maniac who led the charge against Stephen Galloway. And I don't know what's become of her, but she was actually thrown out of a bookstore for rearranging books to make hers more prominent, like physically rearranging books in downtown Toronto. And I kind of felt like it was so embarrassing. But think about the amount of jealousy you have to have in your heart to do something like that. And you think that's going to make a difference. Like, you think throwing Margaret Atwood's book off the table, you're going to sell 4 more books. Like, but she's obviously a very brilliant person. She wrote, again, this favorably reviewed memoir, but obviously like deeply troubled, and the level of jealousy and envy in that space must be crippling. And leads to all this dark triad stuff. So I'm glad I'm just a journalistic hack, because the only novelists I know who have happy lives are the ones who are so massively successful that they don't give a crap. Like, I don't know if Stephen King's a happy guy, but when I read his book about writing and his writing schedule, and he wrote this book about, I think it was just called On Writing, was where he described what it is to be a good writer. And he just like gets up in the morning and wrote, and then like spend the rest of the day doing stuff. And I'm sure he did get involved in one or two political controversies, but when you're
He spends too much time on Twitter, if you want my opinion.
so I maybe my views are on this are dated because I'm just like I don't follow him on Twitter, but I think he could say kind of anything he wants on Twitter and he would still continue to sell a lot of books because he's Stephen King.
Oh, well, sure, yeah.
So I think, and by the way, remember a couple of years ago, J.K. Rowling, her publisher, was that Little Brown? Is that actually like was pressured by its own employees to drop her, and the publisher basically told the employees to fuck off, and that's because J.K. Rowling makes $100 trillion, and that's not going to happen. And the same thing happened here in Toronto. Did you hear about this thing that happened in Toronto 3 or 4 years ago, where this was a Penguin Random House, this merged entity, but there were these social justice coterie within the editorial staff at this downtown Toronto Canadian publisher had a meltdown because they were publishing Jordan Peterson's second book. And like there were tears and I think someone recorded it. The whole thing was so mortifying. But I think Jordan Peterson's first book made something like $30 million or something. And the bosses said we'll have some kind of, we'll bring in emotional support teddy bears for you, whatever, but we're not canceling Jordan Peterson. He makes us a ton of cash and you guys need to put on your big boy pants. And that's because Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson and sells a ton of books, and J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling and sells a ton of books, and they can say what they want. But it goes to your point that for every J.K. Rowling or Jordan Peterson, there's 99 other people we've never heard of whose career ended. And it sounds like some of them.
Yeah, and I've just seen this over and over again where some nobody, some debut author or something will be thrown to the wolves by their agent or editor or publisher or whatever. And then, if there's a controversy involving one of their big money makers, it's just a complete,
that was
silence.
The creepy thing. That was one of the creepy things about this phenomenon is that people's own editors, publishers, and agents would get in on the action. And or at least like disavow them. Like you just mentioned briefly earlier in our conversation that I forget it was Kat, but like somebody was actually unfollowed.
It was Kat, yeah.
Unfollowed on social media, like by their own editor. And this is the Stephen Galloway thing. One of the things that was so sad was once he was falsely accused of rape, the people who turned on him, including the person who, maybe she's still head of creative writing there, like they were his friends. Like one of the ringleaders against him within the department was a woman whose baby, like Stephen had changed this kid's diapers. Like they were such good friends. They'd go to each other's houses for dinner parties, and like Stephen Galloway had actually like taken care of these young children. That's how familiar they were with each other, that they would like go to each other's homes and prepare dinner for each other and take care of each other's kids and stuff. And in that moment, it didn't matter. It was like these stories you hear out of the Soviet Union or China of like people informing on their neighbors or even their own family members, because all that mattered in that moment was saving yourself and distancing yourself from the heretic, and perhaps even getting a share of the heretic's property when they were thrown out of their home, because, hey, if this person's going to the wolves, I might as well take their old pair of shoes. Like it's incredible how that instinct kicks in that says, well, this person's a goner. I might as well, get in on the action in spitting on their corpse. Like it's terrifying that is part of the human impulse. And then at the University of British Columbia, there was no accountability. There was no inquiry. Even after the university had to give a payout to Galloway for this behavior, there was no inquiry. There was no institutional response to the fact that they had smeared this person and career advancement. The people who led the campaign against them they stayed on, and some of them I'm sure were lauded as social justice heroes for their campaign of false accusations against their former friend and colleague.
All right, so John, I told you I had a couple of questions about your other book, Magic in the Dark, but I think we're going to have to maybe save that for another time because we're way over time here. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap this up?
I'll just say, I've enjoyed this opportunity to go down memory lane on some of this cancel culture stuff. My my fondest wish over the last couple of years has actually been to kind of have the culture get to a point where I can write and podcast about my real passions, which, at least since COVID, have been ancient history, board gaming, quirky TV shows. Like when people meet me, I don't talk about any of this stuff. I talk about disc golf. I talk about tennis or squash, or some of my like people who know me from board gaming are kind of surprised to learn that I'm on podcasts and I talk about the culture wars, because I avoid that stuff because it can end friendships. And
Well, just keep tweeting about science fiction shows, and maybe you'll get back on this podcast.
I'm really, so thank you for having me on, because we did talk about the culture wars, but I was also glad for the opportunity to talk about anything except that, because I want to live in a world where like that we can always talk about what's on TV and stuff like that. And because I've had not a lot of friendships, but at least in one case, like a family member I was close with who, I'm kind of not a close relative, but somebody I like to, become estranged because they kind of got into the cult, and it's a shame, and it's over nothing. Like, it's because a lot of the social justice stuff, it hasn't made anyone's lives better, and but it's caused a lot of misery. So I'll be happy when we really can talk about this stuff fully in the past tense.
Yeah, and I saw you're a big fan of BoJack Horseman, so maybe we can talk about that.
Oh my God, that got so dark in the third season. Like my wife tapped out in the second season because she said this is too weird. And then the third season with the dragonfly, remember the dragonfly neighbors?
I've actually never seen it. So
oh my God, that's dark. That's a dark show. But man, is it good? And it didn't get it, that and Bob's Burgers, which is a very different kind of show. Two animated shows that didn't get the critical acclaim they deserve.
Yeah. All right. Well, but we'll definitely have to have you back on again sometime and talk about all that stuff. But
sure.
For the moment, we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Jonathan Kay about the Apple TV Plus series Pluribus and about his book Panics and Persecutions. So, John, thank you so much for joining us.
Talk soon.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jonathan Kay for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.